The old Florida Keys survived hurricanes, bankruptcy, and 40 miles of railroad being torn into the ocean. What they couldn't survive was being saved. There was a time when driving south meant neon motor courts, fishing camps, family-run marinas, and a Key West strange enough to feel like a foreign port you'd reached in a Buick. You didn't reserve every stop from a phone. You drove until somewhere looked good. And before you got there, you had to cross a 7-mile bridge so narrow that some tourists simply refused to drive it. Most of that world is gone now. The bridge is still there. But almost nothing about its story happened the way anyone intended. It was built for trains, not cars. The railroad it belonged to was supposed to make Key West rich, and failed. A hurricane tore 40 miles of it into the ocean after just 23 years. What America did with the wreckage would eventually create the Florida Keys vacation millions of people fell in love with. It would also help destroy the world they'd come there to find. To understand how, you have to go back to when Key West's isolation wasn't a problem at all. It was the reason the city got rich in the first place. Part 1. The city that got rich when ships crashed. Because ships kept crashing into it. The island sits beside one of the most dangerous reefs on one of the busiest shipping lanes in the hemisphere, and the Gulf Stream pushed passing ships in close. When one struck the coral, men called wreckers raced out to salvage the cargo, and the first captain to reach the wreck ran the operation and took the largest share. Tourists today look at the small windowed platforms on Old Town's rooftops and call them Widow's Walks, a romantic name and the wrong story. Men climbed up there before dawn with spy glasses, scanning the reef line for somebody else's disaster. The higher your rooftop, the sooner you spotted the wreck. The sooner you spotted it, the richer you got. In one good year in the 1840s, the salvage crossing Key West's docks was worth roughly $50 million in today's money, flowing through a town you could walk across in 20 minutes. Isolation wasn't Key West's problem. Isolation was the business model. The ocean delivered America's commerce directly onto its reef, and here's how far that took it. By 1890, Key West had around 18,000 people. Miami, 160 miles up the coast, had about 500. The city at the end of nowhere was bigger than the city that would eventually define South Florida. Then the federal government did something obviously good for sailors and quietly disastrous for Key West. It built lighthouses. Fewer wrecks meant fewer salvage auctions, and the fortune that isolation had built began to fade. Key West replaced it almost immediately. Cuban refugees fleeing the wars against Spain brought generations of cigar-rolling skill across 90 miles of open water, and by the 1880s, the island was turning out on the order of 100 million cigars a year. Key West on a box meant the finest smoke money could buy. Then, in March of 1886, a fire tore through the heart of town. 12 hours. 40% of the city. More than 600 buildings gone, including 18 major cigar factories. Manufacturers standing in the ash realized they didn't have to rebuild here. Vicente Martinez Ybor moved his operation to a small Gulf Coast town called Tampa, and others followed. Tampa had one thing Key West couldn't match at any price: a direct railroad connection to the rest of the country. By 1900, the industry had bled north. For most of a century, being surrounded by ocean had made Key West rich. Now the same ocean was making it poor. The isolation that had built the city's fortune had turned into a wall between it and the rest of the country. That's when one of the richest men in America looked at the 100 miles of water between the mainland and Key West and decided the obvious solution was to run a railroad straight through it. Part 2. The man who decided the ocean was in his way. Henry Flagler had already remade Florida once. He'd built his fortune as a founding partner of Standard Oil, then poured it into a state most Americans still pictured as swamp, a railroad crawling down the East Coast, with Miami itself rising at the end of his tracks. By 1905, he was in his mid-70s, and he had one more idea. The United States had begun digging the Panama Canal. When it opened, ships moving between the Atlantic and the Pacific would pass directly below the tip of Florida, and the closest American deep-water port to that new route was Key West. If Flagler could connect Key West to his railroad, he would own the gateway to an ocean of trade. His engineers looked at the map. The map said, no. Past Miami, the land simply gives out. The route south crosses island after island, and between the islands lie channels of moving water, some a few hundred yards across, some miles wide. The bedrock is coral. The weather season includes hurricanes. There were no towns to support construction, no fresh water, no supply lines. Most professionals who studied the problem concluded it couldn't be done, and the newspapers had a name ready for the project: Flagler's Folly. Flagler's response has survived. It is perfectly simple, he said. Build one concrete arch, then another, and eventually you find yourself in Key West. What followed was 7 years of one of the most audacious construction projects in American history. At the peak, more than 4,000 men were working at once, scattered down the island chain in camps and floating dormitories. Everything had to come to them by barge: the cement, the steel, the coal, the food, and every drop of drinking water. They worked in wet heat, in mosquito clouds, on job sites where the nearest dry land was sometimes a mile away. And the ocean fought back. Hurricanes struck the project repeatedly during construction. In 1906, a storm tore a floating dormitory loose and swept it out to sea with the workers still aboard. More than 100 men died. The company grieved, rebuilt, and kept laying track south. Then the crews reached the stretch of water that turned an improbable railroad into something people would call the eighth wonder of the world. Past the settlement at Marathon, the islands stop. Between Knight's Key and the next dry land lies roughly 7 miles of open water, a gap you cannot go around, only across. Flagler's engineers proposed a continuous line of concrete piers and steel spans running clear over the horizon. In the middle of that gap sits a 5-acre scrap of land called Pigeon Key, and during construction it became a company town in the middle of the ocean. Around 400 workers lived there in wooden cottages, waking each morning surrounded by water, walking out onto the unfinished bridge, and building toward a shore they couldn't see. Stand on Pigeon Key today, and the scale still doesn't feel real. In every direction, ocean. Above your head, the bridge those men built. Pier by pier, span by span, the gap closed. And on January 22, 1912, the first through train from the mainland rolled across the completed line and into Key West. Henry Flagler rode in his private rail car. He was 82 years old, frail, and nearly blind. A crowd waited at the terminal, dignitaries, brass bands, and hundreds of schoolchildren singing. Accounts from that day described the old man in tears, saying he could hear the children even though he could no longer see them, and that now he could die in peace. He died 16 months later. For the first time in their existence, the Florida Keys were physically fastened to the United States. A traveler could board a train in New York and step off at the end of the American map. The geography hadn't changed at all, but what the geography meant had changed completely. And here is where the story turns strange. Flagler had succeeded at the impossible part. He was wrong about everything else. Part 3, the railroad that succeeded at the wrong thing. The Great Panama Canal boom, the reason the railroad existed, never came. The canal opened. The freight went elsewhere. Key West did not become the gateway port Flagler imagined, and his oversea extension never earned back anything close to what it cost. He had predicted the city would explode with growth, but the census barely moved. Judged strictly as a business, the eighth wonder of the world was a disappointment. But the railroad was quietly doing something its builder had valued far less. It was teaching Americans that the Florida Keys were a destination. The trains carried dependable supplies and mail into islands that had never had them. And they carried something new: visitors. Partway down the line, on a slender island called Long Key, the railroad's own hotel company built a cluster of cottages among the palms and named it the Long Key Fishing Camp. The fishing offshore was some of the finest on earth, and word spread fast. The Western novelist Zane Grey, then one of the most famous writers in America, came down by train, fell permanently in love with the place, and became the first president of its fishing club. A future president made the same trip. Herbert Hoover fished those same waters years before he ever reached the White House. Flagler had built the railroad to move cargo. What it actually delivered was the idea of the Florida Keys vacation. The islands would need that idea desperately, because down at the end of the line, Key West was dying. By the early 1930s, the cigars were gone, the sponging fleet was gone, the Navy had cut back, and the Depression finished the job. 4 out of 5 residents ended up on public relief. The city government defaulted on its debts and could no longer pay for police or garbage collection. City workers were paid in scrip instead of cash, and merchants took it only because they could use it to pay their own taxes. Men who couldn't find work peddled coconuts on the street or tried to catch sharks for $1.50 a carcass. Children dove off the Mallory docks for pennies thrown by the handful of tourists who still wandered by. And in July of 1934, Key West did something no American city had ever done. It formally surrendered its government to the state, which handed the island to a federal relief administrator named Julius Stone. Stone looked at a bankrupt, gorgeous, half-abandoned town and made a decision that shapes the Keys to this day. He would save it by turning it into a tourist resort. There was just one flaw in that plan. Americans could already reach Key West by rail. What they still couldn't do was drive there, not in one continuous trip anyway. A first version of an automobile road had opened back in 1928, and it was one of the strangest highways in the country. You could drive south from the mainland, down a bumpy rock road until the pavement simply stopped at the edge of Lower Matacumba Key. There, you rolled your car onto a ferry. 20 cars per boat. 2 departures a day, 8 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. The crossing to the next stretch of road took around 4 hours if the weather cooperated, and the fare ran up to $6.50 for a large car. Serious money at the time. Miss the boat, or find it full, and you waited on an island until the next one. That was the state of the art, a road trip with an ocean voyage stapled into the middle of it. The government was already working to close that gap when, on a single night in 1935, nature nearly ended the whole story. Part 4. The night the ocean took the railroad back. Labor Day. September 2nd, 1935. A hurricane came out of the Atlantic and crossed the upper Florida Keys, carrying winds estimated near 185 miles per hour, the most intense storm ever recorded, making landfall in the United States, a record it holds to this day. The barometric pressure at the center dropped to 892 millibars. The storm pushed a wall of seawater roughly 18 feet high across islands that stand only a few feet above the tide. Understand what that means on a coral island. There is no high ground, there is no inland. When the ocean rises 18 feet, there is nowhere to go. Directly in the storm's path were work camps housing hundreds of World War I veterans, men from the Bonus Army era, sent down by the federal government to build the new highway bridges that were supposed to replace the ferries. They were living in flimsy wooden barracks a few feet above sea level in hurricane season, building the next era of Keys transportation while the old ones still ran beside them. As the storm closed in, officials called for an evacuation train from the mainland. It left late. By the time it reached Islamorada, in the dark, in the wind, The sea was already coming over the island. The storm surge struck the train broadside and swept the cars off the track like toys. Only the locomotive stayed upright. More than 400 people died that night, veterans and Keyes families together. In the days afterward, in the September heat, the dead were gathered and burned in funeral pyres because there was no other sanitary choice. Ernest Hemingway, who came up from Key West to help search the mangroves, wrote a furious magazine piece afterward demanding to know who had left war veterans in shacks on the Keys in hurricane season. Its title asked bluntly, who had murdered them? No one was ever really held to account. And when the wind finally stopped, the Florida Keys discovered that the storm had killed something else too. 40 miles of Flagler's railroad were simply gone. Track torn away, roadbed scoured, embankments swept into the sea. The Long Key fishing camp, the little paradise of Zane Grey and the named cottages, was wiped off its island. The Florida East Coast Railway, already broke from the Depression, looked at the damage and made the only decision it could afford. It would never rebuild. The eighth wonder of the world had lasted 23 years. 7 years to build, 1 night to end. In 1936, the railroad sold its surviving bridges and right-of-way to the state of Florida for $640,000. Flagler had poured roughly $50 million into building it. The state bought the remains for barely more than a penny on the dollar. So stand where Florida stood in 1936 and count what's left. The railroad dead. Key West bankrupt. Hundreds of people gone. The automobile road still broken in half by an ocean gap. Every reasonable person could see how this story ended. The Keys would slide back into the isolation they came from, a chain of islands America had briefly touched and then lost. But Florida looked at the wreckage and saw something nobody else did. The hurricane had destroyed the railroad. It had not destroyed most of the bridges. Miles of concrete arches and steel spans still stood out there in the water, bought and paid for, going nowhere, carrying nothing. So Florida didn't rebuild the railroad. Florida paved it. Part 5. America put a highway on a dead railroad. It sounds like a joke until you see the photographs. From 1936 to 1938, work crews moved down the island chain doing something no one had ever attempted at this scale. Converting an ocean-going railroad into an ocean-going road. The rails came up. Steel I-beams went down across the old piers, and on top of them, a concrete deck 22 feet wide, enough barely for 1 lane of traffic in each direction. And then the engineers did something almost poetic with the leftovers. They took Flagler's railroad rails, the actual steel his trains had run on, bent them and bolted them along both edges of the new road as guardrails. Drive to Key West in 1938, and the only thing between your fender and the Atlantic Ocean was the railroad itself, holding the line one last time. At Bahia Honda, the water ran too deep for the usual trick. The old railroad crossed it on a massive steel truss bridge, and the roadway couldn't fit inside the truss. So the engineers put the road on top of it, cars crossing on a deck perched above the girders, one of the strangest-looking bridges ever opened to American traffic. On March 29, 1938, the overseas highway opened end to end. For the first time in history, you could sit down behind a steering wheel in Maine, follow U.S. Route 1 south, and not stop driving until the road ran out at Key West. No ferries, no 4-hour crossings. A toll booth at Lower Matacumba collected $1 per car and a quarter for each passenger, and even the toll disappeared in 1954. The change here is bigger than convenience. A railroad schedules you. It decides when you leave, where you stop, and what you see out the window. An automobile hands all of that to the traveler. A family with a car could leave when they wanted, pull over at a fishing dock because the water looked good, stay an extra night because the motel had a pool, and turn down a side road because somebody at a bait shop said the tarpon were biting. The railroad had connected Key West to America. The highway invited America to come down whenever it felt like it. And down at Mile Zero, that invitation was the whole survival plan. Julia Stone's relief workers had spent the mid-1930s scrubbing bankrupt Key West into a destination, renovating houses into guest rooms, clearing beaches, mailing out brochures painted by federal artists that advertised America's only Caribbean city. The strategy had one missing piece: an easy way to arrive. In 1938, the missing piece was poured in concrete. Then the war came, and the Navy filled the islands. And when it ended, something bigger than the Navy was waiting to head south. Post-war America had cars, cash, paved roads, paid vacations, and a brand new appetite for the family road trip. The Florida Keys were about to have their golden age. Part 6. The Florida Keys. Vacation people still remember. Picture the drive the way a family would have made it in the 1950s. You leave Miami in the morning, the station wagon packed to the roofline, fishing rods rattling against the tailgate. The suburbs thin out, the mangroves close in, and then, somewhere past the mainland, the water shows up beside the road, and it never really leaves again. Every few miles, the pavement lifts onto a bridge, and the world turns blue-green underneath you. The car radio fades. The air through the windows smells like salt and sun-baked asphalt. The road south wasn't a way to get to the vacation. The road was the vacation. Because by the 1950s, a whole civilization had grown up along the shoulders of the overseas highway. Little concrete block motor courts with neon vacancy signs and a dock out back. Family-run fishing camps where the office sold cold beer, frozen bait, and postcards. Trailer parks under the palms. Roadside seafood shacks frying whatever the boats brought in that morning. Charter docks in Islamorada where captains hung the day's catch on racks for photographs. Marathon, Big Pine where tiny key deer wandered out of the pines at dusk. The road gave families every reason to slow down. But sooner or later, every one of those little motels, fishing docks, and roadside stops was leading them toward the same 7-mile stretch of highway, the part of the vacation some drivers genuinely dreaded. None of it was planned. Almost all of it was family-owned. And local histories of the Keys are blunt about what built it. The highway brought family tourism, and the mom-and-pop motels along the roadway thrived. The vacation had a looseness to it that's almost hard to explain now. You didn't book anything months ahead. You drove until a sign looked inviting. You stayed an extra day because the fishing was good. In 1960, when John Pennekamp Coral Reef State Park was dedicated off Key Largo as America's first undersea park, families started strapping masks and snorkels onto the luggage pile too. The reef that had once wrecked ships was now the attraction. The road gave you plenty of reasons to stop. Only one of them made your palms sweat on the wheel. Even the bridges before it had personalities. At Bahia Honda, the highway ran across the top of Flagler's old steel truss, cars rolling along a narrow deck perched above the girders, so high over the channel that passengers swore the car was flying. Kids pressed their faces to the windows. Fathers kept their eyes forward and said nothing. That was just the warm-up. 7 miles of ocean, 22 feet of pavement. The old 7-mile bridge was still, underneath the asphalt, Flagler's railroad bridge, the same piers those 400 men on Pigeon Key had built. It had no shoulders. None. 2 lanes, a painted line, and Flagler's rusting rails as the only guardrail between you and the water. Oncoming cars passed close enough that locals had a nickname for the road, the Highway of Mirrors, because side mirrors kept clipping each other and shattering onto the pavement. Drivers remembered the crossing the way you remember turbulence. Hands at 10 and 2, eyes locked on the oncoming lane. 7 miles is a long time to hold your breath. The passengers got the view, the Atlantic on one side, the Gulf on the other, water in every direction, and no land ahead for minutes at a time. The driver got the truck coming the other way. One Key West woman still remembers crossing it in 1980 in a brand new truck that had developed an uncontrollable shimmy, a two-lane road the width of a two-car garage. Nothing but a low rail and open water past the white line, praying the truck would hold steady until Marathon. She wasn't the only one who felt that way. Some tourists simply refused to drive it at all. The sheriff's substation in Marathon used to get visitors knocking on the door, asking a deputy to drive their car across the bridge for them, and offering to pay for it. Out in the middle of the span, a swing section over Moser Channel would pivot open for passing boats, and the entire highway to Key West would stand still above the waves until the sailboat cleared. By every standard a transportation engineer cares about, the old 7-mile bridge was a bad bridge. Too narrow, too slow, genuinely dangerous. And that is exactly why nobody who crossed it ever forgot it. Getting to Key West still felt like going somewhere. You didn't simply arrive at the bottom of Florida. You crossed 7 miles of open ocean to earn it. And what you earned still felt like the edge of the world. Mile marker 0, the end of US 1, the same road that starts at the Canadian border. Old Town under its tin roofs, shrimp boats crowding the docks in the years when the fleet chased what locals called pink gold. Harry Truman wintering at the naval station in loud shirts, running the country from a porch. Hemingway's old house on Whitehead Street with the 6-toed cats in the garden. Sailors, fishermen, writers, dropouts, and people who had deliberately driven as far down the American road system as it was possible to drive. All of them elbow to elbow in the same 3 bars. After hours of islands and bridges and that white-knuckle crossing, Key West didn't feel like a town in Florida. It felt like a foreign port you could reach in a Buick. The difficulty of the road was doing something no advertising budget could do. It kept the place far away. And here is the cruel part of the story. The road had finally created exactly the kind of place Americans couldn't stop telling their friends about. Every little motel filled another room. Every fishing camp brought another family south. Every postcard of turquoise water sold another vacation. The very thing that made the old Keys successful was quietly making that version of the Keys impossible to preserve. The bridges Flagler built for trains were now carrying traffic no one had ever imagined for them. Something had to give. Part 7. The day the scary bridge became a memory. By the 1970s, the numbers had turned against Old 7. The bridge was pushing 70 years old. It was carrying campers, delivery trucks, and tourist traffic across a deck sized for 1938 automobiles. The concrete was tired, accidents were a grim routine, and the swing span still stopped the only road to Key West every time a mast needed through. Nobody was wrong about any of this. The people calling for a new bridge weren't vandals of history. They were people who drove that road every day and wanted to stop being afraid on it. So by the late 70s, the bridge that had once represented progress had become the thing progress needed to replace. A new bridge went up right beside it between 1978 and 1982, part of a state and federal program that rebuilt or widened 37 of the highway's spans. This one solved the fear entirely. Nearly 7 miles of wide modern concrete, built from massive precast segments, barged down the coast and lifted into place, rising in a long, graceful hump so boats could pass underneath without stopping a single car. It removed the fear. It removed the bottleneck, the swing span, the white-knuckle passing, and in doing that, it quietly removed one more piece of the distance that had made reaching Key West feel like an achievement instead of a drive. Nobody expected how quickly people would start missing the thing that had just been terrifying them. On May 24, 1982, traffic moved onto the new span, and that summer, the Keys threw a party out on its crest. Stone crabs, a band, playing with the ocean falling away on both sides, an annual foot race that still closes the bridge every spring. It was a genuine triumph, and the same people celebrating were already mourning. Residents who would tell you flatly that Old 7 was frightening and they were glad to be rid of it could not stand the thought of tearing it down. So Florida didn't. The swing span came out, and Old 7 retired into a second life as what locals called the world's longest fishing pier, eventually landing on the National Register of Historic Places. Nobody wanted the dangerous old bridge back. Almost nobody could bear to lose it. The nostalgia wasn't a judgment about transportation. The new bridge won that argument outright. It was about something engineers don't measure. The old bridge had made the journey feel like something. The new one made it feel like driving. From 1982 forward, the two bridges stood side by side, the new one filling with traffic, the old one starting an entirely different second life. And a few months before that new bridge even opened, the highway had already proved something else entirely. In March of 1982, the U.S. Border Patrol set up a checkpoint at the mainland end of the overseas highway, searching every car for drugs and undocumented immigrants. Within hours, it produced a 17-mile traffic jam, and reservations across the Keys started canceling by the day. Key West sued to have the checkpoint removed and lost in federal court. So the mayor, Dennis Wardlow, walked out of the courthouse and declared Key West's secession from the United States as the Conch Republic, broke a loaf of stale Cuban bread over the head of a man in a Navy uniform, and surrendered about a minute later, demanding $1 billion in foreign aid. The checkpoint quietly disappeared soon after. It was a joke. But it only worked because something real had changed. A century earlier, Key West got rich because ships came to it whether the mainland liked it or not. By 1982, closed the single road in and out for one afternoon, and the entire tourist economy started to choke. But replacing 7 Mile Bridge didn't end the transformation of the Florida Keys. It accelerated a process that had been running since the first Model A rolled off the ferry, because every improvement to the road was also quietly an invitation. And America kept accepting.
Part 8. When Paradise Became Easy to Reach. Here is the cruelest part of what finally happened to the old Florida Keys. The final blow wasn't another hurricane, another fire, or another bankruptcy. It was success.
The lighthouses made the reef safer. Flagler's railroad finally broke the isolation, even if its commercial dream failed. Julia Stone's tourism gamble rescued a bankrupt city. One solution after another fixed the problem directly in front of it. And every solution made the Keys easier for the next wave of people to reach. By every measure the planners cared about, the highway did exactly what it was built to do. Visitors now spend about $3.5 billion a year in the Keys, supporting more than 24,000 jobs in a county of roughly 80,000 year-round residents. Everyone got exactly what they wished for. And the Keys did not decline because Americans stopped wanting them. They changed because Americans wanted them too much. The strangeness itself became the product. Sloppy Joe's, once a bar where actual writers and fishermen drank elbow to elbow, is a brand now, with other locations, a retail operation, and a line out the door. Mallory Square, once a working dock where sponge boats unloaded their catch, hosts a nightly street performer show for the crowds of visitors filing off buses and cruise tenders. The town didn't lose its reputation for being strange. It kept the reputation and lost most of what had made it true. The road kept escalating too. Boat gave way to railroad. Railroad gave way to highway. Highway gave way to airport. And by the 2000s, the newest way to arrive wasn't a car at all. It was a cruise ship. In 1919 alone, nearly 1 million passengers came ashore in Key West this way over the course of the year, roughly 40 times the island's own year-round population of about 25,000, walked a few hours of Duval Street, and got back on board for dinner. Then, for a few extraordinary months, the machine stopped. The cruise ships vanished during the pandemic. The streets emptied. Residents said the harbor looked clearer than they'd seen it in years. But the overnight visitors kept coming back anyway, people staying in hotels, eating in restaurants, renting boats, actually spending time on the island instead of racing through it. And for the first time in decades, old-timers started saying something they hadn't said in years. Key West felt like Key West again. For one brief stretch, the town got its glimpse of the thing it had lost, and then residents tried to keep it. In November 2020, Key West voters passed all 3 cruise restrictions on the ballot. Roughly 63% backed a cap of 1,500 passengers disembarking per day. About 61% backed a ban on ships carrying 1,300 passengers or more. More than 81% voted to give docking priority to the cruise lines with the best environmental and health records. It was the closest thing in this whole story to a rebellion. A town voting to protect itself from its own success. In 2021, Florida passed a law that expressly voided local ballot restrictions on maritime commerce, effectively nullifying the limits Key West voters had just approved. The vote that had passed with a supermajority of the town's own residents never took effect. The quieter version of the same story sits right on the highway. In Islamorada, the old Holiday Isle resort and its tiki bar, a family-run motel and marina going back to the 1950s, birthplace of a cocktail called the Rum Runner, spent the 2000s passing between developers before its most recent rebuild in 2024 into a 214-room resort under a national hotel brand. Holiday Isle captures the larger pattern. The old, small family-run version gives way to something bigger, polished, and far more expensive. That produces the harder irony. The highway that once carried vacationers toward Key West increasingly carries the island's own workforce in the opposite direction at the end of a shift. Bartenders, cooks, hotel cleaners, boat crews. Because housing near the places they serve has gotten too expensive. Some live on Stock Island, just across the bridge. Others drive in from Marathon, 50 miles up US 1. Same road, same bridges, opposite journey. The houses tell the same story. In a recent county appraisal, out of nearly 9,000 Key West homes eligible for a homestead exemption, only around 3,300 were actually claimed as somebody's year-round residence. The town hadn't run out of houses. It had increasingly run out of houses where anyone actually lived. Not everything vanished. Out on Card Sound Road, the original 1928 route into the Keys, long since bypassed by the main highway, Alabama Jack still fries conch fritters the way roadside Florida always did, surviving in part because the modern road left it behind. Notice where the survivors sit, off the main road or behind a lost vote. None of this required a villain. That's what makes it hard to forgive. Every step made sense on its own. Replace the deadly bridge, widen the dangerous road, let the bankrupt city sell the one thing it had left. Let the cruise lines dock. Nobody set out to erase the old Florida Keys. They just kept rescuing it, one emergency at a time, until there was nothing left to rescue it from except its own success. The 2 bridges. Today, you can walk Old 7 out toward Pigeon Key, the same small island where Flagler's workers once slept between shifts, while modern traffic races passed on the bridge beside you. Look down at the guardrail as you go. That's not ornamental steel. Those are the rails of Flagler's failed railroad, still holding the line more than a century after his trains stopped running on them. On the other bridge, the trip is safer, faster, and easier than any of the families in those station wagons could have imagined. And that is the Florida Keys story in a single view. America spent a century trying to make these islands easier to reach. It succeeded completely. The railroad broke the isolation. The highway brought the families. The new bridges brought more traffic. The airport and the cruise ships brought millions more. And somewhere in the middle of all that success, the strange, cheap, unhurried little world everyone had been trying so hard to reach became something you now mostly have to go looking for. The modern bridge will still get you to the Florida Keys. The old one carries what's left of the Florida Keys people actually miss.